critical mass. So let me start. Hi, everybody. I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. It's my absolute pleasure today to have Rabbi Tamara Malino and Tony Stewart join us as we're discussing how communities can respond to acts of hate and anti-Semitism. The way that this program came about was I've known people in the Spokane community for a long time. I was involved with the Gonzaga Institute for Hate Studies and its founding. And over the years, I've gotten to know people in the human rights community there and also in the synagogue, including Tamar's predecessors. And so when there was an incident recently of hate crime there with the tagging of the synagogue and a Holocaust memorial with swastikas, and Tamar and I talked some, and I was so impressed with how she handled it, how the community handled it. I thought it was a good model for others to hear about and to ask questions about. So that's how this came about. And Tony is somebody that I've known, we were trying to figure out before, certainly since the 90s. He's a key figure in the region, first stepping up against the Aryan nations when they were in their heyday, and has been a voice for human rights for decades there. So Tony also used to be a talk show host doing programs, and so I asked him to interview Tamar. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction to their bios. I'm going to disappear, turn it over to Tony, who's going to talk some and interview Tamar, and then I'll moderate questions and answers. If you think of questions along the way, feel free to add it to the Q&A box, and then I will ask questions for either or both of them, and then we'll finish on the hour. So let me introduce our two wonderful speakers today. Rabbi Tamar Malino is the rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom and Congregation Emmanuel in Spokane, Washington. She's the first female congregation rabbi in Spokane. And before serving in the Inland Northwest, she served communities in New York, San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area. She was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in 2001. And over her career, she has created programs exploring Jewish spirituality, prayer, Jewish culture, history, and Israel. And her central passion in her work is deepening spirituality and strengthening compassion in her community. She lives in Spokane, South Hill with her partner and two sets of twins, which must keep her very, very busy. And Tony is a long bio, but here are the highlights. He's the political scientist. He's a lecturer and author and community activist. He taught at North Idaho Community College from 1970 to 2008. And he also founded and was program producer and moderator of North Idaho College TV Public Forum from 72 to 2008 that aired on PBS stations with viewers in the Northwest and in Western Canada. And he had more than 1,800 weekly programs. He was one of the founding members in 1981 of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, where he served terms as vice president and president of the board. He was a founding board member in 1986 of the 5-state Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, where he served as president during 5 years on the board between 87 and 91. He also founded and chaired the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum Lecture Series from 1970 to 2008 that featured over 568 lectures. I was very honored to be one of the 568. It was a great experience at the college and community. He's won too many awards to name. He's also a member of the Idaho Hall of Fame. And he also now currently works on the advisory board of the Gonzaga University Institute for Hate Studies and is working with a faculty team of digital experts at Gonzaga on a long-term project titled The Story of How Ordinary People Can Do Extraordinary Things in Their Community. Tony is an exemplar of that, as is Rabbi Malino, and I will disappear and turn it over to your capable hands.
Well, Ken, it's a pleasure to be with you. I go back decades with you, and it's such an honor. And Rabbi Tamara Malino, she is a good friend, and she's doing tremendous work. The format we're going to use is the format I used as the host and interviewer on my PBS show for many years. Rabbi, it's such a pleasure to see you again. And I want to personally thank you and congratulate you for the leadership that you're showing, not only with the temple, but with the entire region and community. And thank you for doing this with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really, really feel very humbled and honored to be speaking with you and with Ken, two such longtime tremendous activists in the field. So thank you.
Well, you're just such an incredible asset. We're delighted to have you. I, like Ken, have a long relationship with Beth Shalom and been there many times, and certainly when the challenges were there and continue to be. Maybe we can start with just a little bit of background. In 1973, Richard Butler came from Southern California and purchased land and created what became known as the Aryan Nations. And he had, that was his political arm, and he had what he called a religious arm, the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. And so starting in 1980 and through the next 2 decades, so tremendous number of crimes. We know over 100 felonies committed, 9 murders by people that were associated with him. And we were created, as you know, by defending a victim. His first victim was an owner of a restaurant in Hayden Lake because he was Jewish. And so we came into existence because of that. And of course, not long after that, also a biracial family was targeted. So we faced really many challenges with dealing with hate and hate messages and hate crimes. With you, I'd like to start by asking you a little bit for our people that are listening around the United States about the special place that you are at, and what give us some historical accounts of what you've gone through and how different organizations such as ours and many others have done all we can to be very supportive. But that background, I think, would be very helpful.
Sure. So we are a small Jewish community out here in Spokane. We have at this point about 250 families affiliated together with both synagogues, the Conservative Congregation Temple Beth Shalom and the Reformed Congregation Emmanuel, which currently are both meeting in the same synagogue building, the one that was vandalized. So I think that this community is Spokane is a kind of an interesting place Jewishly, and so the lore is that we're the largest Jewish community between Seattle and Minneapolis. I don't know if that's exactly true, but that's, or the largest synagogue anyway. But I think but in terms of the mentality of the Jewish community here, it feels that way. It's a little bit isolated. Of course, we have relationships with Jewish communities in other places, and most notably Seattle. But it does feel, we do feel small, and we feel a little bit isolated. And I think that that's kind of an important background piece to understand the way in which our community has interacted with the larger Spokane community, the larger Inland Northwest community, and processed this experience of vandalism. And I should say, along with the history that Tony gave, in more recent history, about 6 years ago, right when I started as the rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom, there was a swastika incident on our building as well, a different kind of incident, much smaller, on the interior courtyard, and it turned out it was a high school student who wasn't totally aware of what he was doing. I think partly aware, but not totally aware of what he was doing. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do some restorative justice work with him and meet with him and talk with him and try to have him understand the significance of his actions. And he was able to actually apologize to our temple board, and I think grow from the experience, even though it was a traumatic one for our community, because it was on, we discovered the swastika on Yom Kippur. So it was which he didn't even know that it was Yom Kippur when he put it there. So that should tell you a little bit about his level of awareness. And of course, our community's experience of the impact of it were not totally equivalent. But it was certainly relevant in terms of our congregation's understanding of being somewhat constantly under attack. And I think that's been part, or needing to be defensive. And I think that's been part of the mentality of our community for a long time. And when I first moved to Spokane, which is a little over 10 years ago, I was kind of shocked by the amount of security that we had when we have, police currently. And, since I've been here, we have police cars outside of our building for every program that we hold, every Hebrew school, every Sunday school, every Friday night service, every Shabbat morning service. And when we have special events, for sure. And certainly when we have bigger events, we have lots and lots of security, and we have really strong relationships with local law enforcement agencies as well in order to help us. And when I first came to town, I thought, coming from New York and San Diego, I thought, and it was a different era also 10 years ago, I thought that it seemed like overkill to me. And the amount of time that I've spent in Spokane getting to know the community, getting to know the surrounding areas, and of course, the increase in anti-Semitism and hate crimes in general over the past 6 years has really made that a different experience. And now I'm incredibly grateful for the amount of security that we have. But I think the people who've had a longer history with the Inland Northwest community and the threat of the Aryan nations right down the road were, rightfully accustomed to the amount of security that we needed on a regular basis. So some of the reaction of the community has been defensive in the way that we know that we need our security. We have a building that has concrete walls, which was architecturally interesting at its time, but sometimes feels a little bit like a bunker when you drive up, for better or for worse. And it was really a need for protection. But the other piece of that, and the other side of that, is that it's been incredibly important for our community. And this was true of my predecessors and for many longtime members of the congregation, to create relationships with the larger Spokane community and the larger Inland Northwest community. And Tony is really a representation of that. And those relationships were built and were very strong. And I've been the lucky beneficiary of some of that foundational work that has happened, and then really tried to take it upon myself to continue developing those relationships with leaders in the larger Spokane community, and particularly people who are working on human rights issues and fighting against hate and hate crimes. I'll stop there. I'm sure there's more specifics, but.
Okay. Yes. Well, that is just such a powerful statement. And in my relationship through our organization and individually with your congregation and others of different faiths and religions and other organizations and events throughout the region, I've been so concerned and bothered by how targeted certain communities have been, not only here in the Northwest, but around the country. Certainly the Jewish community and people of color, African American and other, and we see it in the Latino that's been targeted, many others. We see the same thing that's happened to the LGBTQ community and others. So I guess my next question to you would be to expand a little bit before we get into the meaning of hate and what its consequences are. I've been so impressed with how your congregation has reached out to others through certain events you've had. And some of those vary from time to time, but I think this is very powerful for other communities around the country, how when particularly you are experience targets or being targets, share with us some of the things that Temple Beth Shalom's congregation has done in connection with the other communities in our area.
Sure. So I'll say a couple things. I realize I didn't quite complete the thought before and come back around to the current graffiti incident. I think our vandalism incident so when it happened, we realized that we were, again, kind of having this defensive posture of, we had a lot of neighbors who offered to come and help us clean up, and we were not really ready to have people that we didn't know on the campus of the building and kind of deal with that. And so, but we realized that there was a tremendous outpouring of love towards our congregation that really, in many ways, outweighed the hate. And what we wanted to do was make an opportunity for people to react and interact with us us. And because of COVID, of course, we couldn't have a big gathering. And something that had happened a couple of years ago, after the Tree of Life shooting, we had in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, we were able to hold a local vigil, and that was an incredibly powerful experience. We opened, even though again we're feeling a little defensive, we opened the doors of our congregation. We had over 2,000 people, which is really big for Spokane and Spokane area. Maybe it doesn't sound like that much for people from other places, but in Spokane, that's really a lot of people. And from people from all over the community. We had speakers from across different faith traditions, and we were able to really experience the support of communities all around the Inland Northwest area towards us as Jews, given that particular act of hate. But when it was our congregation, which I think maybe would have inspired a similar kind of event, because of COVID, we weren't able to hold it. So what we did was just try to make clear lines of communication. So we opened up, and just anyone who asked me, I said, write a letter, write a note, send it over email, send it over Facebook. It's so important for our community to hear your expressions of support, because I think it really is important. And so we just tried to open up channels for that to happen. And then we held a congregational event where we were able to read aloud a lot of the responses. So members of our congregation were able to receive them as well. And I think that had a tremendous impact. And some of those expressions of support came from corners of the community where we really weren't expecting it. And that was very powerful. And it came from across the political spectrum and across the religious spectrum, and of course, non-religious organizations as well as communities from all over the country. But the local response was a very powerful thing, and I think that was quite helpful. And we also opened up an opportunity for folks to donate to our Yom HaShoah Fund, our Holocaust Memorial Fund, and to be able to repair the Holocaust Memorial sculpture that was desecrated as part of the vandalism. So all of that was really a tremendous way to receive the care and love of our community at large. And really, I think, started to lay the groundwork or continue building on the work that Tony and others have done in terms of connecting other organizations and continuing to fight against hate. In our community as well, I should say, when we had some graffiti on the Martin Luther King Community Center happen in Spokane a few years ago, and in response to the recent hate crimes against Asian Americans, and in other communities being targeted, we've made a big effort to reach out to those communities and communicate our support to them as well, and begin to really build the relationships. And that's the key part. It's not just, we can all send a letter in a difficult moment, but the next phase is to really be proactive and build those relationships, not just during times of crisis, but also having opportunities to really work together for the good of the larger community. So we're trying to do both.
Well, you make an excellent point. Recently, because of certain events, the anti-Semitic activities have really increased. Asian Americans have become very serious targets. Before I get into some specifics in relation to that, I do want to have you to go one step further. In our organizations, and particularly the Kootenai County Task Force Relations, we have experienced over the years that we have to be reactive when things happen, but we have to be proactive between things. And the proactive is an ongoing process that should be taking place daily. You have certainly done a number of very proactive events. I've attended on a number of occasions that very solemn ceremony you have every year, the remembrance of the Holocaust. And you also have in the past invited the community to very special luncheons and all dinners. Share a little bit of that with me, because that builds that kind of connection, and certainly it sends a very powerful message of how we want to celebrate and welcome all people. And at the same time, that connection is there when there are incidents. So share that with us, please.
Absolutely. So we've been fortunate to have some very long time members. Both of those events that Tony describes were in long existence before I arrived on the scene. but really have laid the groundwork. I think we had some members of our congregation establish a Yom HaShoah event, a Holocaust observance event that's every year, not exactly on Yom HaShoah, but close nearby. And we really have made an effort to ensure that that is a broader community event. It's not just an event for our congregation or for people who are remembering family members who've passed away in the Holocaust, but really a much broader community event. We run an essay contest and an art contest for high school students all over the city, and the winners are presented with and read their essays out loud, and they're published in the local paper. And we also have school orchestras from around town participating, and usually speakers not just from the Jewish community and various local, the mayor and various other local officials who participate in our community's observance of Holocaust Memorial Day. And that has really been a tremendous thing, because it serves to do the process of, serves the process of education, of Holocaust education, but it also brings it into the present moment, because a key focus of that has often been someone else speaking about their experience of genocide. And as hard as that always is to hear, it's really important to continue that process of education and of responding to current events as well. So that's one event. And the other event I think that Tony is referring to is what was for a long time affectionately called the kosher dinner. And it was in existence for over 70 years, I believe. And this is a little bit of a taste of small town America in a mostly very beautiful way. The synagogue would put on an event where they would serve a big classic Jewish, Eastern European Jewish meal with brisket and a few other things, and put on some entertainment with Jewish music and things like that. And it was a wonderful community event. And really, when I first came to Spokane, various people I met who were not Jewish, every single one of them would say, I've been to the kosher dinner. And again, we had several thousand people who would come over the course of an afternoon through the doors of the synagogue, buy a meal, sit and eat a meal, enjoy some Jewish music. And I think it really established goodwill, and especially in a community where we had lots of people who've never met a Jewish person before. And this wasn't something that required intense education or high art appreciation. It was just nice to be able to share a meal with our neighbors and have them see what the inside of our synagogue looked like, and meet some folks from the community, and have it be a very low barrier event. And that really promoted quite a lot of goodwill in the Spokane area in general. And it was again a pleasure to just establish those very basic relationships without it being more complicated than sharing a meal together.
Well, it's a long day of wonderful meeting together. There were thousands and thousands of people came. It just was such a unifying process. I just really want you to share that. I think it was very wonderful. Sure. Some years ago, I was invited to a conference at Gonzaga University, and I attempted to do something that was without a lot of knowledge, but I was trying to speak to the basic tenets of the different faiths in the world. And there's some really common threads that run through different religions, and certainly trying to respect the dignity of human beings and love and compassion. And I want to take advantage of your great theological background and discuss that for a few minutes. And that is, today, as I observe the different activities going on and such a variety of religious doctrine, we find a number of religions here and around the world that are very committed to those great principles of love, compassion, whether it be some things in which they would have some different interpretations. So I would like to ask you to share some with us about what are some of those basic, very, very vital tenets that religions or different faiths share with one another.
Well, I really, in terms of my own expertise, can speak about them from a Jewish perspective more specifically than from other faiths. But I do think, with some shared sacred text and as you said, I think that the whole principle of that is that they're in common with other traditions. But in Jewish tradition, we talk right away about the fact that all human beings are made in the image of God, and that requires us to treat each other with a certain amount of respect and dignity to the degree that we would accord that to God as well. And that's a tremendous idea that every human being is deserving of respect and dignity and honor, and really ultimate regard. And I think that that probably cuts across many different religious traditions. In general, also in Judaism, we just place a very high value on life, and we don't talk quite as much about what happens after you die, but there's tremendous value on life, and not just on life in general, but on the life of an individual, right? And the tradition teaches that to save a life is like saving the whole world, in a way to recognize that each human being has a world within him or herself, and that that's important to acknowledge the individuality of a person. And then on top of that, there's also a real recognition of the beauty of the diversity of creation. We don't expect every human being to be like the next, right? We're in many different colors and many different traditions and many different ways of being and living on the world. And that doesn't at all negate the original principle that every human being is made in the image of God, right? So that both of those combined with each other really says that that we really have to appreciate the diversity and the differences between us, rather than trying to minimize the differences between us. But that really that's part of the intention of creation, the divine intention in creation, that we recognize that that diversity. So I think maybe that would be my, as we say in Judaism, on one foot, my quick answer to your question. And I do know that way of approaching the world with compassion and respect and understanding the value of each human life really does cut across many different religious traditions. So
I want to proceed a little further with that. And this is something very troubling. And I know you and I have discussed this before, as well as Ken. What we're seeing, particularly in this region here in Idaho in particular, as one who grew up with a religious faith myself that taught those same wonderful concepts that you have just described in the Jewish faith, we have some groups and individuals, and actually some rather large organizations in the arena of religion, that recently have been very aggressive in really campaigning and with such ideas as that inclusion and social justice is a communist doctrine. And that is so deeply troubling to me as a person of faith, that it is foreign to everything that I have ever learned about the different religions. And I know that in your case, that some faith groups reach out to you more than others do. But can you spend some time to explain how that has emerged and what its consequences may be? In fact, I would add that there's even been movements in our state to say that those wonderful principles of things such as social justice should not be taught in the classroom. And so I don't know where we're headed with that kind of concern, but I would very much like for you to address that troubling trend.
Sure. Well, I think that it speaks to this incredible divide in partly how we use language in our communities, because I think something that someone might identify as social justice, someone else might not identify as social justice. They wouldn't use that language to describe it, but it still is the same act of compassion. So I'm not always sure that the polarization is as extreme as we want to say that it is. Sometimes I think it's semantic, but I do really see that there's this incredible divide between how people approach the world on one sense, as our ultimate mission is constantly to make it a better place, and we see ourselves as responsible for doing that in an ongoing way, and then another way in which that, for whatever reason, doesn't speak to the rugged individualism of the American way of life. I'm not exactly sure, because I don't really inhabit that space on a regular basis. I do know that within Judaism, there are various different ways of interpreting the concept of tikkun olam, right, of repairing the world. And some people define that very narrowly in terms of, in its traditional origins, in terms of practicing the mitzvot, practicing the very specific commandments of Judaism, and that is the process of repairing the world through those mostly ritual commandments. And then there's been in more recent decades, a much broader understanding of that concept, that whatever actions that we participate in that are towards social justice are part of repairing the world. And of course, really one of those can be overlaid on top of the other, because most of the actions that we would do to make the world a better place in a general way also fulfill those traditional commandments, although not exactly in the same way. But I think for Jews, it's a very important concept that is expected of us if we don't, seen as our ultimate mission in the world is to repair. So I'm not exactly sure how to, like I said, inhabit the other side of that divide, because it seems to me that it's kind of the opposite of honoring all lives, that we are responsible to make the world a better place. And I don't really know how someone could see it the other way. I do, like I said, think that sometimes it's semantic, and sometimes it's, we're not supposed to be socially responsible for each other in the way that is lived out through government, but maybe we're supposed to be socially responsible through each other through different institutions. I think there's a lot of variations on that. But particularly with regard to racism and cultural diversity, I think that's very problematic if we're going to say that any conversations that we have about racism in a public forum are construed to be communist. That's a problem, to say the least.
Yes, that is certainly so true. From my perspective, and talking to so many individuals across the United States, we come to the conclusion that a child is not born hating or being able to distinguish between races or gender, whatever it might be. With your experience, why do some individuals grow up to be so loving and inclusive, and others grow up to commit hate crimes and have great hatred for a particular community? I would love to hear your view on how that comes about. What are the factors that lead some individuals on a path that is so destructive compared with other individuals?
Well, I guess I want to bring it back to my most recent specific experience, which is subsequent to the graffiti and the vandalism on our temple building. The perpetrator was apprehended and brought more recently. I mean, he pled guilty and was brought recently for sentencing to court, and our community had an opportunity to testify at that sentencing hearing. And so not so often do you get to be face to face with the person who perpetrated the hate crime towards your congregation. And it was a very powerful, very emotional moment. And I spoke, and a few other members of our congregation spoke. And it really brought home to me just seeing this particular man and what his circumstances were. And I got a little bit of that just by the tattoos on his body and the way that he carried himself, and is that he had suffered tremendously as a human being. It was clear to me that he had been tremendously disadvantaged and not found a place to claim his own power and place on the planet aside from perpetrating hate. And that was the means that he had to say, I belong to this white supremacist community and I can now perpetrate hate on other people. And that's how I make myself, how I feel better about myself, right? And if we look at a lot of the literature around what is it that draws people to be involved in these white supremacist, extremist, white nationalist groups, it's a lot of that feeling threatened by the rest of the world and trying to find a place, and to say, and the whole replacement theory, and we don't need to go into that necessarily, but people who otherwise don't see themselves as grounded and having a rightful spot on the earth. And so that's really, to me, that's just so terribly sad to see that think that their only way of finding their place or finding success in the world is to replace someone else, or to see that at the disadvantage of someone else. And I think maybe that's what I see as the underlying component in why people grow up to hate, is that they can't see themselves making their way in the world in any other capacity. They don't understand why one person would succeed where another person would fail. One person would feel grounded or have comfort or have connection, and another person wouldn't. And so this is their way of finding all those things. And of course, it's utterly misguided. And I think that was very evident to me in meeting this particular man, is that he would there have been so many other places and ways in his life that he would have found love and compassion, instead of being in a situation where the only way that he could prop himself up was to perpetrate an act of hate. And that, I think, was particularly true in his case, because one of the things that was clear is that he was saying in the acts that he did, that he was sort of trying to prove himself in the white supremacist community, that he was worthy of gaining more sway in their organization. And, he was still in the process of starting his own chapter of 14 First, and trying to draw attention to himself unsuccessfully, obviously. Or he drew attention to himself successfully, but he didn't rise in the ranks, I would say.
I think what you just said is very, very powerful, and there's a lot of evidence of that fact. In fact, when Richard Butler and the Aryan nations were here for those more than 2 decades, he recruited young men in particular who had become outcasts. Even their families had rejected them, and he would bring them to the campus or to the compound and say to them, "It's not your fault." And he would use some conspiracies, particularly targeted at saying it's a Jewish conspiracy, trying to get them to belong and to have identity. One of the example I can give you is that some years ago, there were 2 young men. One, I think he's 19, the other one was 21 or 22. And the young man that's 19 was from Spokane, and the other young man was from Idaho, and they got drinking and got very drunk. And the one from Idaho convinced the young man from Spokane to go on and get a small cross and burn it on the lawn of a biracial family. It was really interesting. We negotiated with all of that with the lawyers and with the victims. And so the end result was that the 2 young men were asked, as part of their requirement, to meet with us and to go through this kind of same thing that you did. And so the one from Spokane, it was a tremendous success, and we learned so much about, and he had wonderful parents. And so he was very remorse. The other young man from Idaho was not. And we came to the conclusion that the little bit older man from Idaho had led him into that. And so anyway, to finish the story, after we had these wonderful sessions with him, and he said karma had caught up to him, he really, and we had a religious leader involved and a couple of us from our task force. And in the end, it was such a great success. And then his parents asked me to write a letter for him to go into the military because he didn't get a felony on his record. The other young man had to be answer to the law. So I think that is something. And I also read about what you had to say and the powerful message you had when you confronted that latest incident and what had happened to them. I guess that, we're getting close to, won't be long till we get to the question period, but another question I would have, and then Ken, I'll turn it over to you after this question. I just am so impressed with this interview and the incredible knowledge and power you had. I guess my final question would be, I would like to give you the opportunity to speak to the public that's watching us today, and any advice and message about how they should move forward in the future and how they can make this a better world.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I would just say, in particular, with the conversation that we're having about how to respond to hate and how to respond to hate crimes, I think there's overwhelming evidence that it has to do with the relationships that we have with other people. And kind of to go back to the beginning of what I was saying about our Jewish community in Spokane, which of course, really in many ways what I know the best, is that the temptation when we see a hate crime is to kind of hunker down and say, okay, I want to be as far away from those people as possible. And particular, of course, we have to defend ourselves and we have to take care of ourselves, and we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable to violence or to hate. And on the other hand, the place that we need to dig deep is to say, you know what, I need to have that conversation. I need to have those conversations with my neighbors. I need to have those, and I need to build those relationships. And I think it's part of that process of building the relationship to decide when you can have the more confrontational or difficult conversations, or when you need to be just focused on building the commonalities. But I think, you know, on an individual neighborly level, we need to always be able to stand up against hate and speak against hate, but also really fundamentally practice what we preach and understanding the humanity of every human being and trying to really understand where that person is coming from. And while we might confront prejudice or hate where we hear it and see it, which we need to, that the ultimate goal is really to build relationships of mutual understanding.
Tamara, I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you and you sharing your wisdom and your faith. It's been a special day for me, and I thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ken.
And I want to thank you both for a very powerful and inspiring and important conversation. And I just look forward to the time we could all actually do this in person rather than over Zoom. I invite people to add questions in the Q&A box, and I will moderate those in a second. But I have two questions, one for Tamara and one for both of you, that come out of some of what you were saying. And Tamara, at the beginning, you were talking about the difference in being in Spokane versus in New York or one of the other communities that has a much larger Jewish presence. So I wonder, in that regard, I mean, when there's a incident like the one that your community faced, I mean, obviously it has an impact on everybody, but I wonder if you talk about specifically, is there a different impact or concerns you have about kids in your congregation? If this happened in New York, you know, the mayor would be speaking out, politicians, I mean, it would be a whole drumbeat, and there would be a lot of institutional support for the kids. But when you're very much of a minority in a community, how does it affect kids differently, and what do you do that might be a guidance for other communities that are somewhat in a minority situation to worry specifically about the impact on the kids? And then the second question I have for both of you is related to, again, the difference between being New York and Spokane. If you're a rabbi in New York, or you know, you do work on human rights in New York, there's very little personal threat. But I think where you guys are, and Tony especially, you know, just opposing the Aryan nations from the time Richard Butler showed his face there. You know, how do you navigate that in your own lives to worry about the fact that there are people out there who really don't like you just for who you are or what you're doing? So I'll ask those two, and then I'll ask the questions from the audience.
Tony, do you want to answer that second question first, maybe?
Tamara, you go with your question first. He asked the first one to you.
All right. Okay. So the question about kids in our congregation, I think there's no question in my mind, and of course, you know, I hear it most directly from my kids, that they were afraid. They were afraid. I think maybe made the biggest impact on them starting with the Tree of Life shooting. And they talked about it. In particular, my 12-year-old daughter talked about it recently. You know, I'm always afraid that you know, someone's going to shoot up our synagogue. I mean, she really, it's very at the forefront of her mind. And certainly the graffiti incident, I think, just brought that home, and you know, that kind of added on to that level of trauma a little bit. And you know, and she just talked about she's going to be preparing for her bat mitzvah, having to go into the synagogue every Shabbat and feeling a little bit afraid every week. So I think that that's just part of their reality. And, you know, on a certain level, it's not all that different from them going to school and hearing all about school shootings all the time. I think our kids are not growing up in a world where things are quite as secure and safe as some of us might have in previous eras. And so that's a sort of regular level of anxiety that they live with on top of just COVID anxiety. And so we have to help them navigate navigate that anxiety and still and live in the most productive and positive way possible. And the other thing that my daughter said to me was similar to the question that was asked, like, I don't understand why would someone hate me that much? Why would someone hate us? I don't understand. And so we talked a fair amount about other people being afraid and being disadvantaged for whatever reason, and finding someone else to blame for the circumstances they're in. And a little bit of the conversation that we already had. And I think she's beginning to be sophisticated enough to understand that. But as a whole, with our community, we've really tried to help our kids do the same thing that I was talking about before, both confront the anti-Semitism that they experience in schools, and they do experience it on a regular basis. Most of the high school students that I work with are involved, they're in different high schools, scattered in different high schools all over the city. They're often one of one or two Jewish kids in their school. They hear anti-Semitic things in the hallways. They have to figure out how to respond. Most of the school administrators and teachers don't know how to respond. And we and my education director and I do a fair amount of conversations with school administrators and with teachers to try to help them figure it out a little bit. But our kids sometimes want to just skate under the radar, high school students especially, right? No one wants to be different. And sometimes they say to me, I just don't want to tell people that I'm Jewish. And then we talk through that. And sometimes they say to me, I don't know how to respond, or I wanted to respond, or I didn't want to respond. And, I spend a fair amount of time working with them, talking about what are the contexts in which you want to respond in a confrontational way, and what are the contexts in which you want to respond by taking the person aside afterwards and saying, that really hurt me what you said. What are the ways, do we talk to a teacher? When do we talk to a teacher? When do we not talk to a teacher? Those kinds of practical advice and how to respond in a given circumstance. And as a whole, we give our parents and our kids a fair amount of resources to just talk about what is hate and how does it operate and how do we continue to fight against it. So we often send emails out to our students and to the families in our congregation talking about those things. And we're glad to be the beneficiary of national organizations that do things like the ADL and have lots of curriculum materials that we can continue to distribute. So we'll do all of that.
That is very, very important and such tremendous help. In answering Ken's question, we've had a really a horrific experience ourselves. In the mid-1980s, we chose Catholic priest Father Bill Wasson to become president of our organization. And we became very, very visible and doing an awful lot of work. And so as many of the people in America know, that one night his home was targeted and he was bombed. They tried to kill him. A few days later, they set off bombs in downtown Coeur d'Alene. And that was really a wake-up call for us in a very different way that you have also experienced at the temple. I know Bill Wasserman called me, Father Bill, one day, and he said he'd got a call and he was threatening, and he kind of laughed about it. He didn't take it real serious. He said, they've asked me to do something physically I cannot do. And then it was just a few days after that when his home was bombed. I received two very, very serious threats on my phone at about 3 a.m. There was some days between them, and it was very clear that they were telling me that they were going to kill me. And so it's what you said about particularly the young people. It's very traumatic, and your life changes some. You get more cautious. I took on some measures that I had never done before. And I remember Father Bill saying at the Unity rally after the bombing of his home, he said, it was very frightening, it was very fearful, but I refused to live a life without freedom. And so you go forward. And some people ask you, well, how do you have the courage to continue? But you can't let those who hate win. You just can't let that happen. And so it just, and then we have the same feelings that the young people at the temple have. Why am I hated that badly? And the president of our organization, she's been president, so she's a former police officer, and she's a very great advocate of human rights. Christy Wood has become a target, as I have. And this letters to the editor calling us names. And so you just have to say what Dr. King said to us: you can't hate, because if you hate, you die inside. And so you hate the act itself, but you refuse to be consumed by hate. So, but my other comment would be that in the Spokane area and in northern Idaho, one thing that's been so helpful for us as it has been for the Temple Beth Shalom congregation, we've had a lot of support. People reached out to us of very, very different backgrounds, and we had a lot of rallies and unity rallies and just individual support. And I think in those times, it's really important to gather together with other human rights activists and be supportive of one another. So, but it is a life-changing experience, because you just don't understand. When you're not directing hate at others, you can't understand why, especially when you're trying to promote, as we do in the school systems, education. And we have a program we've had for 35 years with fifth graders and had 36,000 young people through that. And so what happens in the home and what happens in education is very critical, but you have to continue on. Fortunately, the seriousness of that is lessened after the 2000 court trial, in which they were bankrupted and lost the compound. And then of course later, Richard Butler passed away, and many of his followers went other places. So, but someone has to stand up. Silence is a terrible mistake. We saw that in Germany when Hitler was trying to rise to power, and what silence meant.
Thank you both for that. And everybody now, I think, has a better understanding of why both of you are heroes to me. I want to go through some of the questions now. One I can just easily take care of. Somebody just noted they're listening from Toronto and they have the same problems as the US does. Yeah, we have many people actually from around the world. And these are not problems unique to Spokane or the United States. There are a couple of questions that relate to recent incidents. I know in Spokane, your problem has been worrying about white supremacists and their organizing and individual acts and so forth. But we've seen in the United States in the last few weeks, in the aftermath of the war between Israel and Hamas, attacks on synagogues, attacks on Jews, basically people finding the Jewish identified person or thing in front of them and holding all Jews in some ways collectively responsible for things that Israel does, which is, a key part of what anti-Semitism is, or anti-Asian or anti-Black or whatever, holding a whole community and the people who happen to be part of it responsible for whatever your perceived grievances are. So I don't know, Tamar, if you've seen any of that in Spokane, and if not, do you guys have any words of wisdom for communities like New York and LA, the bigger communities that have seen some hate crimes in response to what happened in Israel recently?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say for our community, we really haven't seen much of that. And I'm grateful for that. I don't know. It doesn't mean that it's not happening in some smaller quarters. It hasn't happened in a big public area, and our congregation, our synagogue hasn't been targeted directly, which I appreciate. We actually have put some significant effort into having an ongoing dialogue with a social justice organization in town that has in the past, I think, really perpetrated some acts of anti-Semitism in the name of supporting the Palestinian cause. And that has been, that has been an ongoing conversation for at least the last 3 years. And the incidents that we're talking about mostly took place prior to that. And Ken was instrumental in being the beginning event of bringing those folks to the table with us and talking about instances of anti-Semitism in places where it manifests, not just on the extreme right, but also on the left. And so that's been an important dialogue. And I think possibly, and I don't want to put too much on it, but I think possibly as a result of some of that work that we've already done in those communities, that we're able to, I think that, maybe some of those folks who might have perpetrated not violently or not with graffiti, but in other contexts, maybe protests and things like that, who might have been more inclined to express themselves in an anti-Semitic way are now less inclined to do so. And I really, and I don't want to make huge assumptions about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if our dialogues have had some of that impact. And that's an ongoing dialogue that we have with that particular organization. And I'm really, really very grateful for it. I don't know that I have so many words of wisdom for folks in places like New York and LA that are seeing it, other than the same kinds of conversations that we're having all around. Is that, you know, the model of the dialogue with that community has been very powerful. That social justice organization has been very powerful, and in that case, it's not actually a Palestinian community. It's a community of largely white activists who are interested in racial justice and social justice in other contexts. So that's a little bit of a different conversation. But I think that, again, and maybe this is something of the beauty of being in a smaller place, is that those relationships are really important to build, and they're sort of easier to find in a small place. There's not as many addresses to go knocking at the door to say, hey, we want to talk to you about this. And you know, we get to run into each other on the playground at the elementary school too. So that helps ease the tension maybe, and begin to build those relationships in a more solid way. But I think, as always, we just have to continue to speak up against the things that we find very problematic, and not let that compromise our own values if we're working towards anti-hate and continuing mutual understanding and compassion.
Thank you. Tony, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I just would echo what Tamara said. She did it really well. That is really, really well said.
Thank you. So the next question is, how could those of us from outside the Jewish community best support the effort to deal with various different manifestations of hate, speed, crimes, and so forth? That is, what specific efforts can we make in addition to supporting and communicating with good candidates for local, state, and federal elections to become active and proactive allies?
Tony, do you want to answer that?
Well, thank you very much. The first thing one needs to do, and our organization's been doing that for 40 years, and other groups have too, when there is a victim, the first thing that we need to do is to become an ally of that victim. And when we work with a victim or victims, we have a law process we go through, but we do nothing that the victim does not want to have happen. For example, some victims want to deal with it very privately. Others want to go to court. So it's so important to respect their wishes. And also, there's a process that those who are victims go through, and you need to be there for that process. And it can take on many different stages. But it's so essential to speak out, and particularly those who aren't being discriminated against or targets. It is our duty more than anyone else's to do that. That's why I was so proud of the fact in December 1980, when Sid Rosen's arrest was targeted with terrible graffiti, that 15 people went out the next night to say to him, "We're here for you." And then it was that next February 1981 that we, thanks to Dina Tanners, who was a great member of the Jewish community, and I met, and we created the task force. In other words, you have to be active, and you have to say no to hate. And there's nothing more important than a community being supportive of those who are victims.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to, we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask two separate questions. I think they're mostly for Tamar, and then I'll let everybody get on with their day. So one question is, aside from relationship building, which is obviously central, what do you think is important for non-Jews to learn about anti-Semitism so they can be educated not to perpetrate it or maintain incorrect beliefs about Jews? And second is just a follow-up on the person who was arrested for the hate crime at the synagogue. At his sentencing, did he show any remorse, and will he be leaving the hate community?
I'll answer the second question first. He did show some remorse. He apologized. I'm not 100% sure, again, how much comprehension was attached to that apology. It was sort of clear that of one of the things that his lawyer told him he needed to say. And, one of the things that I would say that came out of just watching the legal process around, and I'm sure Tony could speak to this too, around arresting him and and his pleading one way or the other in the sentencing, is really the limits of the legal system to deal with actual issues of hate and of racism, because of the way in which he was charged and the crime in which he perpetrated and the way in which it was going to play out. Is a relatively minimal sentence. I think I can't remember what it came out to, but something around the neighborhood of 9 months. And there's no mechanism for establishing a relationship and continuing to really have serious dialogue about anything that he actually did. So he apologized. I think he was regretful. I'm not sure how regretful he would have been if he hadn't been caught. And that's just, so we've been talking within our community and not so much had a chance to follow up on it yet, but one of the people who spoke at the trial is a just absolutely amazing treasure, a member of our community, Carla Pepperzak, who's a Holocaust survivor, and worked in the Dutch resistance during the Shoah, and is kind of constantly does Holocaust education and speaks in many different contexts. And she spoke at the trial and was like, I just want to go talk to him. So at some point we may try to facilitate further conversation with him about, how to just get out of that hate community and how to grow into more productive relationships and try to speak directly to his instincts of anti-Semitism. So, and I think that in general, to sort of morph into the first question that you asked about what are ways in which non-Jews can educate themselves about anti-Semitism, there really are tremendous resources out there. One of my favorite ones to go to always is Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away recently, but has written beautiful pieces about confronting anti-Semitism, both for how Jews can respond and also how non-Jews can respond, and really the broader context of anti-Semitism with regard to hate and racism in general. So that's one kind of go-to and relatively readable place to start in terms of education. But I think on a regular basis, that it's always approaching what you hear and see with critical thought. I think that the stereotypes around Jews are sort of pervasive in some ways and underneath lots of communications that we have in our broader culture. And just like we have unconscious bias about race, I think there's for sure unconscious bias about anti-Semitism, and it's incumbent upon all of us to continue to explore that within ourselves and to examine the responses we have to different things and why we respond and how we respond, and then also to use critical thinking in regards to the material and the endless amounts of media that is out there and that we all consume on a regular basis.
Well, thank you for that. I know, Tony, you have a quick final word.
My only thing is, it's been this incredible pleasure to do this program with both of you, and I have such great admiration for both of you and all the work that you both do. And so I'm just grateful to have been part of this program, and we must just continue the work.
And I'm grateful to both of you. And one added thing, Tamara, to your last question, in terms of if people want, there's on the Bard Center for the Study of Hate website a whole syllabus project that has many classes for colleges, interdisciplinary and historical, about anti-Semitism. So if people are really interested about how to teach it, there's a lot of material on the bcsh.bard.edu website. And with that final plug, let me thank you both and thank everybody for their attention. And I wish you a very good afternoon and no more hate crimes in Spokane.
Thank you. And thank you again for inviting me to participate. Really, it's an honor, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. So thank you so much.
Same here.
Thank you all. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.